My name is Keva Charisma. I'm 36 years old, a communications consultant by profession, and a woman most people describe as steady. I live in a city where ambition is loud and personalities compete for oxygen, yet somehow I've always moved quietly through rooms. Not invisible exactly, just unthreatening. At least that's what they thought. People usually assume I'm gentle because I don't interrupt. They assume I'm naive because I ask questions instead of making accusations. They assume that because I forgive easily, I must not feel deeply. I've learned that calm women are often mistaken for simple ones. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation or exposing secrets for applause. It's about something far more uncomfortable. Choosing forgiveness when pride demands punishment. It's about loving a man who once betrayed me and standing at an altar knowing the entire history between us. Yes, I married the man who once cheated on me. And on the day I was supposed to walk away forever, I decided forgiveness was stronger than betrayal and took him back at the altar. But this is not a fairy tale about blind devotion. It's a story about quiet power, about how betrayal reshapes you in private long before anyone notices the shift, about how silence can be a strategy instead of surrender. When people hear that I forgave him, they assume weakness. They imagine tears, pleading, desperate attachment. What they don't imagine is discipline. They don't imagine clarity. They don't imagine a woman who understands exactly what she's doing. I won't pretend I wasn't hurt. I was. Betrayal doesn't bruise the surface. It fractures the architecture of trust. It makes you question your instincts, your value, and your perception of reality. For a long time, I wondered if loving deeply had made me foolish. But something happened between the moment I discovered the truth and the moment I stood at that altar. Something subtle, internal, irreversible. This story will take you through that transformation, through the small dismissals I ignored, the roles I accepted without protest, the quiet shift in my posture when I realized I had been underestimated. You'll see how silence can sharpen rather than shrink a woman, and you'll understand why forgiveness, when chosen consciously, can be the most dominant act of all. I'm not here to dramatize him as a villain or myself as a saint. We were both flawed, we were both human, and in the space between betrayal and reconciliation, I found out who I really was. Have you ever been mistaken for weak simply because you chose peace over chaos? Before I was a bride standing at an altar with history behind my smile, I was the woman everyone described as lucky. Lucky to have a man like him. Lucky to have stability. Lucky to be chosen. His name was Daniel. Charismatic in the effortless way that makes people lean in when he speaks. He worked in venture capital, moved quickly, thought quickly, and laughed loudly. Next to him, I seemed muted. That's how people framed it. Kiva is grounded, his friends would say. She balances him. She keeps him calm. They meant it as praise. But what they really meant was that I absorbed what he didn't want to carry. At dinner parties, I was the one refilling glasses, smoothing over awkward jokes, and asking thoughtful questions that kept conversations flowing. When Daniel cut someone off mid-sentence, I would gently circle back, "You were saying?" So the moment didn't fracture. I wasn't invisible. I was functional. His family adored me for practical reasons. I remembered birthdays. I sent handwritten thank you notes. I coordinated holidays so no one felt excluded. They called me such a good woman. Good. That word followed me everywhere. Not brilliant, not powerful, not formidable. Good. Even at work, where I advised CEOs on how to control narratives during corporate crises, people were surprised when they saw me dismantle a problem in minutes. "You're sharper than you look," one executive once told me, smiling as if he'd offered a compliment. Sharper than I look. I learned early that softness disarms people. They speak more freely around you. They underestimate what you register. And because I rarely corrected their assumptions, they assumed there was nothing to correct. With Daniel, the dynamic was subtle but consistent. He made decisions quickly, restaurants, travel plans, investment choices. I'd offer input, but if he countered confidently, I would nod and say, "That works." It wasn't a submission, it was efficiency. Or at least that's how I framed it. When friends joked about him being out of my league, I laughed lightly. When someone asked how I managed to lock him down, I deflected. I didn't defend myself. I didn't need validation, or so I thought. What no one saw was how carefully I observed everything. The way his tone shifted around certain women. The way he held eye contact was half a second too long. The way his phone screen angled slightly away from me at night. I didn't accuse. I didn't panic. I cataloged. Being underestimated gave me space. Space to think, space to notice, space to decide who I wanted to be when circumstances eventually forced clarity. But back then, before the first real fracture, I still believed in the version of us everyone applauded. I believed my steadiness was enough to anchor any storm. I believed love was a choice renewed daily, not something that could quietly erode beneath polished smiles. To them, I was the supportive fiancée, the calm presence, the good woman. To myself, I was still becoming something I didn't yet have language for. The first cut wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on a collar, no anonymous message lighting up my phone, no trembling confrontation in a dimly lit room. It was a laugh. We were at a networking event Daniel had insisted I attend, an upscale rooftop gathering overlooking Lake Union. String lights, curated cocktails, ambitious people pretending not to scan each other's name tags. I wore a navy silk dress, and the small gold hoops my mother once told me made me look dangerously composed. Daniel was in his element, animated, expansive, magnetic. I stood beside him as he introduced me to a woman named Elise, mid-30s, sharp jawline, venture-backed confidence. She worked at a startup Daniel had recently invested in. They already knew each other well enough to skip formalities. "Elise, this is Keva, my fiancée." She smiled warmly. "Oh, I've heard so much about you." That sentence should have felt reassuring. Instead, something about the way Daniel chuckled, low, amused, tightened in my chest. "Only the good parts," he said quickly. It was subtle, a joke, harmless to anyone else listening. But I noticed two things. First, he didn't look at me when he said it. Second, Elise held his gaze a fraction longer than politeness required. They slipped easily into conversation about quarterly projections, investor dinners, and late strategy sessions. I asked one thoughtful question about user retention metrics. Her answer was sharp, impressive. Daniel blinked, almost surprised I'd entered the technical lane so comfortably. "Oh," he said lightly, placing a hand at the small of my back. "Keva's brilliant at work stuff. She just doesn't like to brag." Work stuff. I smiled. I've spent years shaping crisis communication frameworks for Fortune 500 executives, but in that moment, I was reduced to a charming hobbyist. Elise tilted her head. "You two must never stop talking strategy at home." Daniel laughed again. "Trust me, I do enough talking for both of us." Another joke, another ripple. Everyone smiled. I did too. But inside, something registered. On the drive home, I asked gently, "You and Elise seem close." He kept his eyes on the road. "We work together a lot. It's normal." "I know," I said evenly. "I just didn't realize it was that frequent." He exhaled through his nose, the sound of mild irritation masked as patience. "Keva, don't start. She's important to the firm. That's it. Don't start." Two words that reframe curiosity as conflict. I nodded and let the silence settle. Not because I was intimidated, but because escalation without evidence felt undisciplined. That night, lying beside him, I noticed his phone buzz at 12:17 a.m. He turned it face down without checking it. Another small detail. Alone in the bathroom later, I studied my reflection under the unforgiving light. I didn't look insecure. I didn't feel hysterical. I felt alert. The first cut isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself as betrayal. It arrives disguised as intuition. A misaligned tone, a deflected question, a laugh that doesn't include you. The next morning, Daniel kissed my forehead before work and told me I was overthinking. He said it softly, like reassurance. And I almost believed him. Almost. Because while everyone else dismissed the moment as nothing, I stored it carefully in my planner that evening. Not an accusation, just an observation. Date, location, feeling. I didn't know then whether it would matter. I just knew I wouldn't forget it. After the rooftop evening, nothing exploded. There was no dramatic unraveling, no sudden shift in his behavior that would justify confrontation. Instead, what followed was something far more dangerous: normalization. Elise's name entered the conversation casually. We had to stay late. Elise couldn't finalize the numbers without me. Elise thinks the firm might pivot next quarter. Elise is actually smarter than most of the guys in the room. Each mention was reasonable, professional, contextual. If I reacted to everyone, I would look insecure, so I didn't. But I noticed patterns. Late nights became more frequent. His phone began living in his hand more often than on the table. When I walked into the room unexpectedly, he would subtly angle the screen away. Not dramatically, just enough to signal privacy. Privacy isn't guilt, I know that. I work in crisis communications. I understand nuance, but secrecy has a rhythm, and I began to hear it. One evening, we were having dinner at home. I'd cooked lemon rosemary chicken, his favorite. We sat across from each other at our oak dining table, the one we picked together after debating wood grains for 40 minutes like it was a life decision. His phone buzzed again. He glanced down. A small smile flickered, barely there, reflexive. "Work?" I asked gently. Gently. "Yeah," he said quickly, locking the screen. "Just Elise freaking out about a presentation." I nodded. "And you seem close?" He exhaled sharply this time, not angry, just tired of the question. "Kava, we're partners on a deal. It's intense." That's how high-performing teams operate. High-performing teams. The framing shifted from relationship to ambition. If I questioned it, I risked sounding unsupportive of his success. "I trust you," I said quietly. And I meant it. Trust, to me, wasn't blind. It was disciplined. I wasn't going to accuse without proof. I wasn't going to become the suspicious fiancé scanning phone records at 2 a.m. So I rationalized. He's ambitious. He's driven. You admire that about him. I told myself that discomfort is not evidence. That jealousy is not intuition. Strong women don't compete with ghosts. But small things accumulated. At a friend's birthday party, Elise arrived unexpectedly. Daniel hadn't mentioned she'd be there. They greeted each other with familiarity that had texture, an inside joke, a shared glance, the ease of repetition. When I joined their circle, the conversation shifted. Not obviously, just slightly. Later that night, one of Daniel's friends pulled me aside near the bar. "You're cool with them working so much together?" he asked, tone casual but probing. "Of course," I replied. He shrugged. "You're more relaxed than most women." More relaxed. There it was again, the quiet expectation that if I were perceptive, I would be possessive. And if I wasn't possessive, I must not be perceptive. I started noticing how often Daniel interrupted me in group conversations. Not rudely, just confidently. He would finish my sentences or redirect topics when he thought they were losing momentum. I used to see it as efficiency. Now I wondered if it was positioning. I didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, I adapted. I spoke less in public settings. I watched more. I paid attention to timelines, to tone shifts, to unexplained absences framed as strategy dinners. I wasn't shrinking. I was collecting. Still, I told myself I was being rational, mature, secure. But here's the truth no one talks about. When you normalize small disrespect long enough, it rewires your threshold. You begin to question your own standards. You negotiate with discomfort. It's not dramatic, it's gradual. And by the time you realize the pattern is real, you've already participated in sustaining it. I stayed calm, I stayed supportive, I stayed good. But something inside me had stopped assuming innocence. I didn't accuse him of betrayal, not yet. I just stopped dismissing my own perception. There's a moment in every relationship where you realize you've been cast in a role you never consciously auditioned for. For me, it happened on a Sunday afternoon. Daniel was pacing our living room, Bluetooth in his ear, discussing a delayed funding round. His voice was animated, persuasive, layered with urgency. I was at the dining table, reviewing a client's crisis statement, restructuring language so it sounded accountable without admitting liability. Two different worlds, one shared space. When he hung up, he ran a hand through his hair and said, "God, I need something stable in my life." He didn't look at me when he said it. He walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a bottle of sparkling water. I looked up from my laptop. "What do you mean?" He leaned against the counter. "Everything's volatile right now. Markets, investors, timelines. At least I don't have to worry about us. At least I don't have to worry about us." It was meant as reassurance, but what I heard was an assignment. I wasn't a partner in that sentence. I was infrastructure. Emotional real estate, a guarantee. Stable, predictable, reliable. Safe? Over the next few weeks, I began noticing how often that dynamic surfaced. When he was stressed, I became the listener. When he was excited, I became the audience. When he was uncertain, I became the reassurance. And when I needed space to process something, when my own work became heavy or complicated, I edited myself down to fit his bandwidth. Not because he told me to, because the role had formed organically. At dinner with his parents, his mother once smiled at me and said, "You're exactly what Daniel needs. You keep him grounded." Grounded. Another word for containment. I started asking myself quiet questions. Who keeps me grounded? Who absorbs my volatility? When do I get to be complicated? It wasn't that Daniel didn't care. He did. He remembered my coffee order. He booked spa weekends when I seemed tired. He posted photos of us with captions about finding his peace. But peace is often code for compliance. One evening, as we prepared for a charity gala, I stood in front of the mirror fastening a delicate clasp at the back of my dress. Daniel stepped behind me, adjusted the fabric at my waist, and smiled at our reflection. "You always look so put together," he said. "You make my life look good." There it was. Not "you make my life better." You make my life look good. Presentation, optics, stability. In my profession, I know how powerful appearances are. I help corporations preserve them daily, but I had never intended to become one. At the gala, I played my part flawlessly. I charmed donors, redirected awkward questions, and smoothed over a tense exchange between Daniel and a rival investor with a single well-timed joke. People praised us as a power couple. I smiled. But inside, I felt the shift solidify. I wasn't his equal in chaos. I was his refuge from it. And refuge, while valuable, is rarely consulted before decisions are made. That night, as I placed my leather planner on the bedside table, I wrote something different. Not a date, not a detail, just a sentence. I have allowed myself to become essential but not prioritized. Seeing it in ink did something to me. It didn't make me angry, it made me aware. Awareness is quieter than confrontation, but far more dangerous to complacency. I began to understand that the role I had been assigned was useful, flattering even, but it was incomplete. And incomplete roles eventually fracture. I didn't know yet how that fracture would reveal itself. But I knew this much. I was no longer willing to be the background stability in someone else's spotlight. Not without being seen fully. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen the night I found proof. It happened on a Wednesday morning in the most ordinary way possible. Daniel had left early for a strategy breakfast. The apartment was quiet, except for the low hum of rain against the windows. Seattle in its truest form. I sat at the kitchen island with my coffee and my planner open, reviewing my schedule for the day. That's when his tablet lit up on the counter. Not with a dramatic message, not with anything explicit, just a notification preview. "Elise, last night meant more than I expected." There was no emoji, no explanation, just that sentence. I didn't grab the tablet immediately. I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline people describe in betrayal stories. What I felt instead was stillness, a kind of internal quiet so complete it almost felt detached. I walked over. The screen had already dimmed. I picked it up, entered the passcode I'd known for years, he'd never hidden it from me, and opened the message thread. There it was. Weeks of conversations that blurred professional language into something intimate. Late night reflections, private jokes, emotional vulnerability he had once reserved for me. And then the line that reframed everything. I don't know why it feels easier to talk to you than to her. Her. Me. I read it twice, not to confirm, to absorb. There was no explicit confession of physical betrayal in that thread. But emotional infidelity is rarely theatrical. It's incremental. It's built on redirected intimacy. And the most striking thing wasn't anger. It was clarity. For months, I had been calibrating my perception against doubt, telling myself I was rational, secure, mature. Now there was no ambiguity. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't disappeared for days. He hadn't treated me cruelly. He had simply chosen to invest emotional depth elsewhere. I placed the tablet back exactly where it had been. Then I sat down. This is the part where many women would immediately confront, demand answers, cry, rage. I didn't, not because I was numb, because something inside me had shifted from reaction to evaluation. I asked myself one question. What does this mean about who I am willing to be? Not what does this mean about him, about me. For the first time, I stopped framing the situation as something happening to me and started framing it as information available to me. I thought about the role I had been assigned: stable, predictable, reliable. The emotional constant, the one who would absorb and forgive small fractures. If I confronted him in that moment, the dynamic would remain intact. He would apologize, he would rationalize, I would process. We would work through it. And I would still be infrastructure. I didn't want infrastructure anymore. I wanted partnership, or nothing. The rain continued tapping against the windows. I closed my planner and stood up. When Daniel came home that evening, I greeted him the same way I always did. Calm, polite, measured. He kissed my cheek. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said softly. And I was. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because the confusion was gone. Clarity is painful, but it is powerful. That was the day something shifted. Not in our relationship. In me. I stopped hoping the pattern wasn't real, and I started deciding what kind of woman I would be once it was. After that Wednesday morning, I didn't change overnight. I refined. There's a difference. Daniel didn't know I had read the messages. He moved through the apartment with the same rhythm. Morning coffee. Quick kiss. Phone always within reach. If there was guilt, it was subtle. If there was awareness, it was contained. And I let him believe everything was unchanged. But internally, my silence shifted from uncertainty to intention. I stopped asking about Elise altogether. Not in a cold way. Not in a pointed way. I simply removed her name from my vocabulary. When he mentioned late meetings, I nodded. When he said he'd be out of town for a conference she was attending, I responded with logistical questions instead of emotional ones. What time is your flight? Do you need me to handle the dry cleaning before you leave? Efficient, neutral, steady. He seemed relieved. The absence of tension can feel like safety to someone who fears accountability. But my quiet wasn't compliance anymore. It was an observation without interference. At work, I found myself thinking differently. I've built a career on crisis anticipation, mapping scenarios before they erupt. I started applying that discipline to my own life. What if this continued? What if it escalated? What if it ended? Not in panic, in planning. One night, Daniel lay beside me, scrolling through his phone, a faint smile ghosting across his face before he quickly masked it. Months ago, I would have asked who he was texting. Now, I turned onto my side and opened a book. He glanced at me. "You're quiet lately." "I've been thinking," I replied. "About what?" "Long-term things." He chuckled softly. "That sounds ominous." "It's not," I said calmly. "It's responsible." He didn't press further. The truth is, silence unsettles people when they're used to your emotional transparency. When you stop offering access to your internal world, they feel the shift, even if they can't name it. He started filling the space with small reassurances. "You know I love you, right? You're the best thing in my life. I don't know what I'd do without you." Months ago, those words would have comforted me. Now I evaluated them. Love without alignment is sentiment. Dependence without integrity is convenience. I began rebalancing my life in ways he didn't immediately notice. I accepted more client travel. I reconnected with friends I deprioritized during wedding planning. I re-examined our shared finances, not suspiciously, but thoroughly. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing for clarity. One evening, as we attended a small dinner with friends, someone joked about marriage being the ultimate trap. Daniel laughed loudly. Not for me. I already caught the calmest woman in the room. The table laughed. I smiled. But this time, I felt something different beneath the smile. Not hurt, not insecurity, distance. Because calm is only powerful when it's chosen, not when it's assumed. On the drive home, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. But my grip was lighter, not withdrawn, just no longer anchoring. Silence had become my choice, not my default. And choice changes posture. He thought my quiet meant trust. He didn't realize it meant assessment. He thought the absence of confrontation meant forgiveness. He didn't realize it meant I was deciding whether forgiveness would even be offered. For the first time since that rooftop evening, months ago, I felt entirely in control of my own narrative. Not because I was winning, but because I had stopped reacting. And when a woman stops reacting, she starts positioning. When people imagine preparation, they picture visible action, meetings, dramatic conversations, bold moves. My preparation looked like routine. That was the advantage. Daniel believed my silence meant peace had been restored. Our wedding planning continued. The venue was booked. The guest list has been refined. Deposits paid. He teased me about color palettes. I teased him about his indecision over cufflinks. From the outside, we were a couple moving forward. But internally, I was recalibrating my entire life. The first thing I did was emotional. I stopped confiding in him about my vulnerabilities, not out of spite, out of protection. When a major client crisis nearly collapsed a quarter's worth of work, I handled it without leaning on him for reassurance. When I felt overwhelmed by family expectations around the wedding, I processed it with a friend instead of him. I was gently withdrawing my emotional investment from the joint account we once shared. He didn't notice, because he was still withdrawing from it too, just elsewhere. The second shift was practical. I reviewed our finances in detail. We weren't married yet, but our lives were already intertwined. Joint savings for the wedding, shared apartment lease, overlapping subscriptions, informal agreements about future investments. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic. But I mapped everything: accounts, contributions, access points. Not because I planned to punish him, because I refused to be unprepared. At work, I requested a meeting with my firm's managing partner under the guise of discussing long-term strategy. In reality, I was renegotiating my own trajectory. More equity, more autonomy, more travel opportunities. If my relationship collapsed, I would not be professionally destabilized. Daniel thought my increased focus on work was ambition sparked by wedding expenses. He complimented me for being so driven lately. I thanked him. What he didn't see was the psychological shift in me. I began observing him without attachment. At dinner, when his phone buzzed and he reflexively smiled before catching himself, I noted it. When he mentioned Elise less frequently, but with more casual ease, I noted that too. Guilt had matured into comfort. That told me everything. One evening, I overheard him on the balcony speaking softly. "I just need to get through the wedding chaos," he said. "Then things will settle." There was a pause. He laughed under his breath. "You know it's complicated." I didn't step outside. I didn't interrupt. I stood in the kitchen and felt something crystallize. He wasn't confused. He was compartmentalizing, and he believed he could manage both worlds indefinitely. That was the moment I understood the leverage I truly held. Not evidence, not exposure, but choice. I was the stability he relied on, the reputation-enhancing partner, the calm fiancé who made him look balanced and grounded in a high-volatility industry. If I withdrew, quietly, decisively, the consequences wouldn't be theatrical. They would be structural. Still, I didn't act impulsively. I studied patterns. I reread our old messages from years ago, the early days when vulnerability flowed freely between us. I compared them to the tone of his current conversations. It wasn't just the attraction he had redirected. It was intimacy. And intimacy, once diverted, rarely returns to its original channel without deliberate effort. So I asked myself a harder question than, has he betrayed me? I asked, do I want to marry a man who seeks emotional refuge elsewhere when things feel complicated? The answer didn't arrive as anger. It arrived as clarity. But clarity doesn't always demand departure. Sometimes it demands confrontation with yourself first. Everyone around us believed we were moving toward a wedding. They didn't realize I was moving toward a decision. And decisions, when made in silence, reshape outcomes long before the ceremony begins. The private reveal wasn't explosive. It wasn't a dramatic discovery of hotel receipts or undeniable proof of something physical. It was a conversation I was never meant to hear. 2 weeks before the wedding, Daniel left his laptop open on the dining table while he showered. I wasn't searching. I had stopped searching, but a notification slid across the screen, calendar sync confirmation. Weekend, Napa, D+E. The date wasn't random. It was 1 week after our honeymoon was scheduled to end. My body didn't tense. It didn't shake. It adjusted. I clicked into the calendar. The entry was coded simply. No descriptive notes, but the shared invite included Elise's personal email. I didn't scroll further. I didn't need to. The significance wasn't about whether he planned to go. It was about the assumption that he could. Marry me, honeymoon with me, then resume something parallel. Not because he was cruel, because he believed he could manage it. That belief told me more about our dynamic than any love confession ever had. I closed the laptop gently before he returned from the shower. At breakfast, he kissed my forehead and asked if I was excited. So excited, I said calmly, and I was, just not for the reasons he thought. That afternoon, I left work early and drove to the waterfront alone. The sky was overcast, the air sharp with salt and wind. I sat on a bench overlooking Elliott Bay and let the reality settle fully into my chest. He wasn't confused. He wasn't torn between two women in emotional agony. He was confident in his ability to maintain both. And here was the quietest truth of all. He assumed I would stay. That assumption was my leverage. Not because I intended to blackmail or expose him, but because when someone builds their life around the certainty of your stability, your withdrawal becomes seismic. I opened my planner and wrote 3 columns. Confront now, cancel the wedding, public fallout, marry him, attempt repair, monitor indefinitely, marry him, with terms, with awareness, with power redistributed. The third option startled me. Not because it was manipulative, because it required immense discipline. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't blind trust. It isn't surrender. Forgiveness, when chosen consciously, is control over your response, not submission to someone else's failure. I thought about our years together, the real laughter, the genuine intimacy we once shared, the way he looked at me before ambition began fragmenting his attention. I asked myself something brutally honest. If I walk away today, is it from strength or from wounded pride? The answer wasn't immediate. But as the wind pressed against my coat and the water shifted in quiet waves, I realized something profound. I didn't want to leave because I was hurt. I wanted to leave because I felt underestimated. And that distinction mattered. Because if I chose to stay, it would not be as the calm, unquestioning infrastructure he relied on. It would be as a woman fully aware of the truth, choosing forgiveness, not because she lacks options, but because she is redefining the structure. By the time I drove home, my face was serene. Daniel greeted me at the door with a distracted smile. "Long day?" he asked. "Productive," I replied, and it had been. He thought the wedding was inevitable. He didn't realize the real decision had already been made. Privately, completely, without a single raised voice. There's a myth that decisions are loud. That is when a woman reaches her breaking point. She explodes. She throws rings. She cancels venues. She sends messages that scorch reputations. My decision happened in silence. 3 days before the wedding, I sat alone at our dining table. The same oak table we had once debated, like it symbolized permanence. The seating chart lay in front of me. Names arranged carefully. Families intertwined. Futures implied. Daniel was at the office, finalizing what he called one last push before taking time off for the honeymoon. I looked at the empty chair across from me and imagined 2 futures. In the first, I canceled everything. I told him I knew. I watched as shock fractured his confidence. There would be apologies, maybe tears. Our families would ask questions. Some would praise my strength, others would whisper about timing. I would leave with dignity intact and love unresolved. In the second, I married him blindly. I pretended not to know. I hoped marriage would correct what character had not. I monitored his phone for years. I shrank into suspicion. I became the woman I never wanted to be. Neither future felt powerful. Then there was the third. I would walk down that aisle fully informed, fully aware, not naive, not desperate. I would take him back at the altar, not because he deserved immediate absolution, but because I had decided forgiveness was stronger than betrayal. But forgiveness would not mean forgetfulness. It would mean a restructuring. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. Not dramatically, just a consultation about prenuptial agreements and postnuptial modifications. I framed it as standard due diligence for two professionals with growing assets. It wasn't revenge. It was alignment. If he wanted a wife who was stable and strategic, he would have one. But she would not be unprotected. Later that evening, Daniel came home unusually affectionate. He wrapped his arms around me in the kitchen and buried his face in my neck. 3 days, he whispered. Can you believe it? I can, I said softly. He pulled back slightly, searching my face. You've been different lately. Different how? Stronger, he said after a pause. Calmer. I almost smiled at the irony. I've just been thinking about what marriage really means, I replied. And? It means choosing someone with your eyes open. He nodded, misinterpreting my words as romance. That night, as I lay beside him, I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel like a martyr. I felt sovereign. Because here's what no one tells you. When you know the truth and choose your response deliberately, you reclaim control of the narrative. I wasn't staying because I feared being alone. I wasn't leaving because my pride demanded spectacle. I was choosing the irreversible path, marriage, with terms he didn't yet understand. And if he failed to rise to them, I would leave not as a wounded woman, but as one who had offered grace consciously. Forgiveness in that moment felt less like softness and more like discipline. The altar would not be a place of blind devotion. It would be a place of measured decision. And I would stand there knowing exactly what I was doing. The week of the wedding unfolded like a beautifully choreographed performance. Florals arrived. Family members flew in. My mother cried softly over the table settings. Daniel moved through it all with celebratory energy, unaware that beneath my composure, I had already restructured the architecture of our future. Moving in silence doesn't mean doing nothing. It means acting without announcing. 2 days before the ceremony, I met with the attorney again, this time in person. We finalized a prenuptial agreement that Daniel had initially viewed as just smart planning. He'd signed it casually weeks earlier when I first introduced the idea, framing it as protection for both of us in volatile industries. He never read it with suspicion. He trusted my steadiness. The agreement wasn't punitive. It was balanced. But it included clear clauses around asset division, infidelity parameters, and financial transparency triggers. Not theatrical, structural. If emotional loyalty faltered again, legal ambiguity would not. I also shifted something more subtle, access. I updated beneficiaries on certain personal accounts. I adjusted my investment allocations to ensure independence regardless of marital status. I secured a separate savings buffer large enough to relocate, restart, recalibrate without disruption. No one noticed. Why would they? I still attended cake tastings. I still laughed during rehearsal dinner speeches. I still leaned into Daniel during photos. Our chemistry authentic in moments that weren't about deception. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. Love and betrayal can coexist. He wasn't a villain. He was compartmentalizing desire and comfort in ways that felt manageable to him. But I no longer lived in his management system. The night before the wedding, we sat together on the edge of our bed, the apartment quiet after days of noise. Nervous? He asked, lacing his fingers through mine. A little, I admitted. About what? I held his gaze steadily. About whether we're both ready to be fully honest in a marriage. He blinked, then smiled softly. Of course we are. He believed that. Or he believed he could become that later. Either way, I didn't push. Because the altar would be my moment, not for exposure, but for declaration. Forgiveness requires power, and power requires preparation. The morning of the wedding, as I stepped into my dress, my mother adjusted the veil and whispered, "You look so peaceful." I was. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing about my decision was reactive. As the music began and the doors opened, I saw Daniel waiting at the end of the aisle. Handsome, confident, certain. Certainly, I was walking toward him without conditions. He didn't know that I had already chosen forgiveness over spectacle. He didn't know that taking him back at the altar would be my act of quiet dominance, not submission. When I reached him, he squeezed my hands tightly. His eyes were bright. Mine were clear. The vows we spoke were traditional: love, commitment, partnership. But beneath the words was something unspoken. I am choosing you with full awareness. And if you betray this again, I will leave without hesitation. No one in that room felt the gravity of that internal contract. They saw romance. I felt equilibrium. I married the man who once cheated on me, not because I was blind, but because I had positioned myself so that love was no longer a risk. It was a choice. And choices, when made in silence, carry the deepest consequences. Marriage didn't explode. There was no immediate confession, no dramatic unraveling, no guilt-induced breakdown on the honeymoon balcony. What happened instead was quieter and far more revealing. The first consequence wasn't his, it was mine. Because when you forgive consciously, something shifts in your posture. You stop grasping. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop trying to be indispensable. On our honeymoon in Santorini, Daniel reached for me with the same familiarity as always. We laughed. We swam. We took photos against the white stone and the blue water, but I was no longer leaning toward him emotionally. I was standing beside him. There's a difference. He began noticing it around the fourth day. You feel calmer, he said one evening as we watched the sunset from our terrace. I am, I replied. About us? About myself. That answer unsettled him more than doubt ever would have. Back home, the subtle consequences continued. I stopped asking where he was when he worked late. I stopped checking whether his phone buzzed during dinner. I stopped adjusting my schedule to accommodate the last-minute changes he made. Instead, I filled my time deliberately. Dinners with friends, weekend conferences, client travel that expanded my network beyond our shared circles. Daniel began encountering a version of me he hadn't calibrated for, a wife who loved him but did not orbit him. The first visible crack appeared one Friday evening. He came home early, unexpectedly. I was dressed for an event, a speaking engagement I'd accepted months earlier but hadn't emphasized. You're going out? He asked. Yes, I said lightly. Oh, he hesitated. I thought we might order in. I made plans, not defensively, not sharply, just factually. He studied me for a moment, as if recalculating something invisible. That night, while I stood on a stage discussing corporate accountability and narrative ownership, he texted twice. How's it going? Miss you? Months ago, those messages would have warmed me. Now they registered as awareness. He was beginning to feel something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The second consequence surfaced socially. At a dinner party hosted by one of his colleagues, Elise was present. She greeted me warmly, perhaps expecting the same unassuming fiancé she once met on a rooftop. Instead, she met my gaze steadily. I smiled. Congratulations on the Napa expansion, I said casually. Her expression flickered. Daniel stiffened slightly beside me. I hadn't accused. I hadn't exposed. But I had signaled awareness. And awareness destabilizes secrecy more effectively than confrontation ever could. For the rest of the evening, Daniel remained close to me, physically attentive in a way that felt almost protective. Not protective of me, protective of his equilibrium. Because here's the truth about quiet dominance. When you withdraw desperation, you create space for the other person to feel the weight of their choices. He began asking more questions about my schedule. He began initiating deeper conversations at night. He began offering vulnerability I hadn't requested. The consequences weren't explosive. They were psychological. He could no longer rely on my unquestioning stability as background infrastructure. He had to face the possibility that my calm was no longer guaranteed. And once a man realizes the ground beneath him is conditional, not permanent, his behavior shifts. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't mention what I knew. But for the first time in our relationship, he felt something I had carried for months. The awareness that love is not assumed. It is chosen daily, and choice can be revoked. That realization had begun to settle in him, quietly. He just didn't know yet how far the consequences would go. The unraveling didn't begin with a confession. It began with fear. 3 months into our marriage, Daniel's behavior shifted in ways even he couldn't mask. He became attentive in excess. He over-explained his whereabouts. He initiated conversations about long-term trust without prompting. It wasn't guilt alone. It was instinct. Something in him sensed the recalibration of power. One evening, I came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table, my leather planner open in front of him. Not flipped through aggressively, just resting there. I wasn't snooping, he said quickly. It was on the counter. I nodded. That's fine. He hesitated. You've been different. I poured myself water before responding. Different how? Detached, he admitted. Like you're not fully here. That word lingered between us. Detached. For months I had felt the emotional drift. Now he was experiencing its echo. I'm fully here, I said calmly. I'm just not clinging. He exhaled, tension surfacing. Why does that sound like a warning? It's not a warning, I replied. It's maturity. But he didn't feel reassured. Because maturity removes illusion. A week later, the real panic surfaced. I returned from a 2-day conference to find him pacing the living room. His phone lay face up on the coffee table, a silent offering. I ended it, he said abruptly. I set my suitcase down slowly. Ended what? He swallowed. Elise. The air was still. I didn't ask how long it had continued after the wedding. I didn't ask for details. He mistook my composure for ignorance. I don't know what I was thinking, he rushed on. It was stupid. It wasn't even real. I love you. I've always loved you. I studied him carefully. Not as a wounded wife, as an evaluator. Why now? I asked softly. He hesitated. Because I felt like I was losing you. There it was. Not moral awakening. Loss of certainty. You weren't losing me, I said evenly. You were experiencing accountability. His face tightened. Do you know? I held his gaze, calm, unblinking. Yes. The word landed heavier than shouting ever could have. His shoulders dropped, not in relief but in exposure. For how long? He whispered. Long enough. Silence stretched between us. He moved toward me instinctively, as if proximity could repair what discipline had restructured. I'm sorry, he said. I thought I could manage it. I thought it didn't mean anything. I know, I replied. That startled him. You know? You didn't think you'd lose anything, I said quietly. You thought I was permanent. Tears gathered in his eyes, not dramatic but real. I was wrong. Yes, I agreed. He expected anger. He expected tears. He expected interrogation. Instead, he encountered finality, because here's what he was only beginning to understand. By the time he panicked, I had already decided who I was. The forgiveness I offered at the altar wasn't conditional on confession. It was conditional on growth. And growth cannot be forced by fear alone. I chose to marry you knowing, I said softly. Not because I didn't have options, because I decided forgiveness was stronger than betrayal. His breath caught. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequence, I continued. It redistributes power. He sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the weight of what that meant. It was too late to fix the imbalance with apologies. Not because I was leaving, but because I was no longer naive. And once innocence is replaced by clarity, a relationship either evolves or fractures under truth. He finally understood what I had understood months earlier. Love survives only when both people recognize it can walk away. And I had already proven I could. Calmly, completely, without spectacle. The confrontation didn't happen in a storm. It happened on a Tuesday evening over tea. No raised voices, no shattered glass, no accusations hurled like weapons. Just two adults sitting across from each other, finally without illusion. Daniel had stopped pacing by then. The initial panic had burned off, leaving something quieter. Humility, maybe, or fear refined into awareness. I need you to tell me everything, he said softly. I stirred my tea slowly before answering. No, you don't. His brows pulled together. Why wouldn't I? Because the details won't heal you, I replied. They'll only feed your guilt. He stared at me as if recalibrating who I was again. You're not angry? He asked. I was, I said calmly. Months ago. That realization unsettled him more than if I had shouted. You knew before the wedding, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Yes, and you still married me. I did. Why? The question broke from him, raw and unguarded. Why would you do that? I met his eyes steadily. Because I wanted to see if you would choose integrity without being forced. Silence. The kind that presses against the walls. I didn't, he admitted. Not immediately, I corrected gently. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly. You should have confronted me. You should have. No, I interrupted softly. I didn't need to. He looked up. I needed to know who you were when you thought I didn't know, I continued. That told me more than any apology ever could. He absorbed that slowly. And what does it tell you now? He asked. That you're capable of compartmentalizing your values when it's convenient, I said evenly. But you're also capable of fear when you realize you might lose stability. That makes me sound terrible. It makes you human, I replied. He sat back, eyes glassy but controlled. So where does that leave us? Here's the part people expect to be dramatic. It wasn't. It leaves us at a decision point, I said. I forgave you once. Before you even knew I knew. Not because you earned it. Because I decided forgiveness was stronger than betrayal. He swallowed hard. But forgiveness isn't endless, I continued. It's disciplined. It requires reciprocity. He nodded slowly. I'll do whatever it takes. I shook my head gently. Not whatever it takes, whatever is honest. That meant therapy, transparency, access without defensiveness. No more hidden compartments labeled manageable. It meant he had to rebuild, not perform remorse. You don't hate me, he said quietly. No. Why? Because hatred is reactive, and I had already moved beyond reaction. I married you with my eyes open, I said. If I hated you, I would have left before the altar. That truth landed heavier than condemnation ever could have. He reached for my hand cautiously, as if unsure whether he still had permission. I let him hold it, not as a surrender, as a choice. This is your last clean slate, I said softly. Not because I'm threatening you, but because I value myself. He nodded, tears slipping freely now, not from humiliation, but from recognition. The confrontation ended not with a slammed door, but with a shared understanding. I was no longer the calm background he could rely on without effort. I was the partner he had to meet consciously. And if he failed again, I would leave without rage, without spectacle, without hesitation. Because quiet dominance doesn't demand noise. It demands alignment. It's been 2 years since that Tuesday evening. People still describe me as calm. They're not wrong, but the calm they see now is different from the calm I once embodied. Before, my steadiness came from a desire to preserve harmony. I believed that if I absorbed enough tension, loved enough, forgave enough, everything would stabilize around me. Now my steadiness comes from self-trust. Daniel did the work. Therapy, radical transparency, no more coded calendar entries, no more angled phone screens. The performative charm softened into something quieter, more accountable. But this story isn't about his transformation. It's about mine. I am no longer infrastructure. I am partnership. There's a subtle shift in how I enter rooms now. At dinner parties, I don't smooth over every awkward moment. If someone interrupts me, I continue speaking without apology. If a joke diminishes me, I let silence expose it instead of rescuing the speaker. I don't perform easily. I embody clarity. Daniel feels it too. Not as distance, but as equilibrium. He asks before assuming, he shares before hiding, and when he falters emotionally, as all humans do, he does it in the open. The difference is not perfection, it's visibility. Sometimes women ask me privately, how did you forgive him? I tell them the truth. I didn't forgive him because I was afraid to lose him. I forgave him because I refused to lose myself. There's power in walking away. But there's also power in staying, when staying is chosen, not endured. When I stood at that altar, fully aware of his betrayal, I wasn't surrendering. I was setting a standard he didn't yet understand. Forgiveness was not a reward. It was an opportunity. And opportunities can expire. Today, I don't monitor his behavior. I don't audit his devices. I don't live in suspicion. Because if integrity fractures again, I won't negotiate with it. I will leave calmly, legally, cleanly. Not because I am bitter, but because I am complete. The emotional wound I once carried, the fear of being valued only for usefulness, has healed. I am valued now for presence, for intellect, for the boundary, for choice. And if that ever changes, I know exactly how to reposition myself. That's the difference. I didn't become harder. I became sovereign. And sovereignty is quiet. It doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It simply stands. I married the man who once cheated on me, and I took him back at the altar because I decided forgiveness was stronger than betrayal. But the woman who made that decision is not the same woman who once normalized small cuts. She sees clearly. She chooses deliberately. She loves without illusion. And most importantly, she knows she can walk away. If you've listened this far, you might still be asking the question people always ask me. Was it worth it? Here's my honest answer. Forgiveness is not about saving a relationship. It's about deciding who you want to be when someone disappoints you. When I discovered the betrayal, I had every reason to leave loudly, to expose, to humiliate, to reclaim dignity through spectacle. But spectacle isn't power. Power is choosing your response without losing yourself in someone else's failure. I married the man who once cheated on me, and I decided forgiveness was stronger than betrayal, not because he deserved immediate redemption, but because I refused to let bitterness define me. Forgiveness did not erase consequences. It did not erase accountability. It did not erase boundaries. It simply allowed me to act from strength instead of injury. Some people believe staying is a weakness. Some believe leaving is the only proof of self-respect. I believe the truth is more nuanced. Strength is not in the direction you move. It's in whether you move consciously. If you leave from clarity, that's power. If you stay from clarity, that's power too. But if you react from pride alone, you give your peace to someone who already mishandled your trust. The quiet dominance in this story wasn't about controlling him. It was about controlling myself, about refusing to beg for transparency, about refusing to compete for loyalty, about refusing to become suspicious just to feel secure, and most of all, about knowing I could walk away and choosing not to, until I no longer needed to prove that I could. So I'll leave you with this question. If you discovered betrayal today, would your next move come from wounded pride or from self-respect? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening.
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.